It began not in America, not in a hangar, but in a room in Tokyo, dimly lit, heavy with cigarette smoke and full of disbelief. On a wooden desk lay a captured intelligence report, marked in red, "Confidential, North African Theater." The words that followed would puzzle the Imperial Japanese Air Staff for months. According to German observers, American P-38 Lightnings were suddenly climbing faster, reaching altitudes no one thought possible. Their rate of ascent now exceeds 4,000 feet per minute, one report read. Performance gain unexplained. Believed due to field modification. A Japanese technical officer leaned over the document, his brow furrowed. The Americans, he thought, were reckless with machines, all improvisation, no discipline. But this was different. A single absurd trick, as the report described it, had somehow turned a flawed aircraft into a monster. What could have happened? To understand it, we must go back to the dust, heat, and desperation of North Africa in 1943, where pilots were dying, engines were suffocating, and one anonymous mechanic decided that the rulebook was not worth a life. At the time, the P-38 Lightning was America's great hope. Designed by Lockheed's brilliant minds, it was the most advanced twin-engine fighter of its day, sleek, futuristic, fast. It could outdive anything the Axis fielded, and with two turbo-supercharged Allison engines, it promised unmatched power at high altitude. On paper, it was perfection. But war is not fought on paper. In practice, the Lightning was haunted by a single flaw. Above 20,000 feet, its power faded. The turbos that should have given it superiority became sluggish. Pilots would pull the throttle forward, and the response came too late. German Bf-109s and Fw-190s danced around them, attacking from above. American formations broke apart, not from lack of courage but from lack of air. One squadron log from Tunisia reads like a quiet tragedy. Lost 2 more at altitude, it notes. Engine starved again. By that spring, many crews quietly called their aircraft the Twin Coffin. The problem wasn't bravery. It was temperature. The P-38's twin Allisons depended on a complex intercooler system to keep air temperature stable as it passed through the turbos. But that system was governed by a thermostatic valve, a mechanical brain, that opened and closed to maintain a safe range. In theory, it protected the engines from overheating. In reality, it strangled them. At altitude, the air was cold enough that the valve stayed partially closed, restricting the flow of charge air. The result was simple. Less oxygen, less boost, less power. No one in Washington knew. No one at Lockheed knew. But on a dusty airstrip outside Bizerta, a staff sergeant had seen enough. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't even a commissioned officer. He was a mechanic, the kind of man who worked 12-hour days under the roar of engines, whose hands knew every vibration, every smell of metal and fuel. He watched pilots he'd known by name fail to return. And one evening, standing beside the gutted shell of a Lightning, he decided he couldn't wait for permission. He followed the intercooler lines like a surgeon tracing arteries. He found the thermostatic valve, a small circular device, almost invisible among pipes and clamps. It clicked faintly when touched. That click had killed men. He took a wrench, loosened the fitting, and rewired the system so that the valve could no longer close. It would stay open, permanently. That single, illegal act would change the aircraft forever. When the modified Lightning took off the next morning, the pilot noticed the difference immediately. The climb was crisp, effortless. The engines sang with a steady, hungry tone all the way to 25,000 feet. He leveled off, expecting the usual fade in power, but it didn't come. The machine held strong, steady, alive. He returned from the mission silent. When he stepped down from the cockpit, he looked at the mechanic and said one sentence that the crew would repeat for years: "Whatever you did, don't undo it." That evening in the mess tent, the word spread. By the end of the week, more P-38s on the field had their thermostats bypassed. By the end of the month, an entire squadron was flying with open valves. And by the end of the campaign, the Lightning, once mocked by German pilots as slow above the clouds, was now outclimbing the hunters that had preyed on it. How could something so small have gone unnoticed by Lockheed's finest engineers? How could one mechanic in the desert solve a problem that months of testing in California had failed to reveal? The truth is both simple and damning. The war had moved faster than the bureaucracy meant to fight it. Factory engineers designed for ideal conditions: cool air, clean fuel, controlled environments. But war was chaos. Airfields filled with dust, temperatures soared, and pilots pushed their machines harder than any test pilot ever dared. What worked in theory failed in practice. When the modified Lightnings started returning from missions with better performance, squadron leaders began sending discreet memos up the chain. They spoke of unexpected altitude gains, of improved turbo response. At first, higher command ignored them. Then came the combat reports, German fighters being forced into dives to escape. One major even called it a miracle of mechanics. In reality, it was physics and courage. The Japanese intelligence officer reading that report months later could only shake his head. He had studied the P-38's original schematics. He knew its weaknesses. He knew how the thermostatic valve worked. Bypassing it, he noted in the margin, would be absurd. Dangerous. And yet, it had worked. The officer closed the folder, staring at the rising smoke from his cigarette. What kind of air force, he wondered, allows a sergeant to rewrite its engineering? What kind of nation rewards defiance with victory? The answer, of course, was the same one history would give, the kind that wins. Back in North Africa, the Lightning's new behavior was rewriting aerial combat. German interceptors that had once circled high above Allied bombers now found themselves matched or outclimbed. The twin-tailed silhouettes that had once lagged below now rose like silver arrows through the thin air. The psychological shift was immediate. One Luftwaffe pilot, captured later in Italy, admitted to interrogators, "The P-38s are no longer easy. They come up too fast. They shouldn't be able to, but they do." In a sense, the anonymous mechanic had achieved what millions of dollars in research could not. He had made the Lightning the predator it was meant to be. Still, within the command structure, the act was heresy. Maintenance officers warned their crews not to alter factory specifications. Technical inspectors threatened disciplinary action. But pilots were pragmatic. They wanted results. And results don't argue. By late 1943, at least 3 major P-38 groups in the Mediterranean were using some form of the bypass. The modification had become an open secret. Letters home referred to it as the little fix. Combat statistics began to reflect its impact. Missions lasting longer, fuel consumption more efficient at altitude, fewer losses to overheating or power fade. And still, the man who started it all remained unnamed, because he had to. There was no glory in breaking orders even when it saved lives. The irony, perhaps, is that the first official confirmation of his act didn't come from the US at all. It came from Axis intelligence, those same German and Japanese reports wondering why American fighters had suddenly improved. In a world consumed by codes and secrets, the enemy knew before the engineers did. The Japanese called it the absurd trick. They believed it had to be propaganda, a psychological operation meant to boost morale. But the data was too consistent, too specific. It was real. A bypassed valve had rewritten the sky. Years later, long after the war, an aging Lockheed engineer would admit that the field modification had forced the company to rethink its designs. "They beat us to it," he said. "The field got there first." And so, what began as a whisper in the desert became a redesign in the factory. The later P-38J and L models integrated the solution. A cleaner, freer intercooler flow system that finally gave the Lightning its true wings. But that evolution had a price. It exposed something uncomfortable about war, that salvation often comes from those the system ignores. How many other absurd tricks went unseen? How many lives were saved by hands that history forgot to name? If stories like this intrigue you, if you want to know how innovation, desperation, and defiance shaped the outcome of a world at war, stay with us. Subscribe and keep watching. Because this was only the beginning. The anonymous mechanic had solved one problem. But the storm that followed would test not just his idea, but the very machinery of American military command. And somewhere, half a world away, Japanese intelligence was already trying to steal his secret. By the summer of 1943, the Axis intelligence network was restless. Reports from the Mediterranean front kept contradicting earlier assessments. The P-38 Lightning, once dismissed as an over-engineered curiosity, was now climbing like a single-engine fighter and holding power far above its expected limits. German officers whispered about a new supercharger type. Tokyo's attaches wanted answers. One of them was a man named Lieutenant Hiroshi Kondo, a technical observer stationed in Berlin. Educated in aeronautical engineering, fluent in German and English, Kondo's job was to collect and translate captured Allied reports for the Imperial Army. On the morning he first read the German communiqué about the modified Lightnings, he thought it was a joke. A bypass thermostat? It sounded like the kind of crude trick pilots invented in bars. He asked to see the evidence. Days later, on an airfield outside Augsburg, he stood beside a captured P-38 airframe, one of the few brought down almost intact. German mechanics had inspected the engines and found that the intercooler control valves had been fixed permanently open. They called it barbaric. But the test flights didn't lie. Even in German hands, the modified system produced higher boost pressure at altitude. Kondo wrote to Tokyo, "If true, this shows that the Americans tolerate undisciplined field modification. But it also shows that such initiative yields real tactical effect." His tone was half disgust, half reluctant admiration. Japan's aircraft industry, rigid and hierarchical, would never allow a mechanic to alter factory systems. Yet here was proof that chaos could outperform precision. Thousands of miles away, the American war machine was in its own quiet conflict. Word of the unauthorized modifications had reached Lockheed's headquarters in Burbank. Engineers were furious. The thermostatic valve had been carefully designed to maintain optimal airflow temperature and protect the turbo from overcooling. Removing it, they argued, risked icing, condensation, and engine failure. But field reports told a different story. Pilots were returning with higher success rates. Their engines weren't failing. They were thriving. The contradiction tore through the chain of command. At Wright Field in Ohio, Air Technical Service Command convened emergency meetings. Officers debated whether to issue a technical order approving the modification. No one wanted to admit that an enlisted man in a tent had outthought the engineers of Lockheed and Allison. Pride stood against proof. Colonel Thomas Landon, one of the test chiefs, summed it up in a single sentence that would later appear in his memoir: "The desert fixed what the drawing board broke." Meanwhile, on the front lines, the legend of the bypassed valve spread like folklore. Pilots treated it as a talisman. They named their planes after it: hot air, free flow, no valve Nancy. When new replacements arrived from the States with the original system intact, ground crews didn't even ask permission anymore. They made the cut, ran the line, and moved on. The improvement was measurable. Combat climb data from the 1st and 82nd Fighter Groups showed consistent gains of up to 15% in rate of ascent and sustained engine output at 25,000 feet. In dogfights, that translated into life or death. A few hundred extra feet of altitude often meant the first shot. But back at Lockheed, men in suits were struggling with something much heavier than engineering. It was humiliation. The company's internal memos reveal a mix of disbelief and irritation. Field tampering with intercooler thermostatic units has been observed, one report stated dryly. This is a deviation from design which, while possibly effective short-term, may reduce component life expectancy. Yet every week, more data arrived proving that component life expectancy was a luxury the front lines didn't have. Kondo, reading the intercepted correspondence months later, began piecing together the human side of the story. He saw that the American system, so decentralized, so full of competing voices, was also its greatest strength. In Japan, a single misstep could end a career. In the U.S. Army Air Forces, even a mechanic could rewrite doctrine if he happened to be right. Still, he needed proof of the exact change. Late that year, Kondo attended a conference in Berlin where Luftwaffe engineers presented their findings on the captured P-38. He took careful notes. The bypass increased turbo efficiency at high altitude by roughly 8%. Cylinder head temperatures remained within safe limits. Boost pressure held steady even above 25,000 feet. The Germans, for all their disdain, admitted the results were impressive. "Absurd," one of them muttered, "but effective." Kondo smiled. He knew what that meant. He drafted a long report for Tokyo, titled simply, "Unregulated Cooling System Modification, U.S. P-38 Lightning." In it, he described how the Americans' reckless field innovation had produced measurable gains. He ended with a warning: if this culture of improvisation is characteristic of their air forces, it will make their technical development unpredictable. Back in North Africa, the man who started it all was oblivious to spies and reports. He only knew that the pilots he worked with were coming home more often. He still had no name in the paperwork, no rank above sergeant, and no certainty that what he'd done wouldn't one day be punished. but the results spoke for themselves. He watched the Lightnings take off each morning, the desert winds swirling around their tails, and he felt a strange pride mixed with fear. He had tampered with something sacred. And yet, when he saw the twin trails rising clean into the pale sky, he knew it had been worth it. By the time American engineers officially recognized the bypass as a valid modification, the war had already moved north. Italy, Sicily, Enzio. Everywhere the P-38 went, the trick followed. New ground crews learned it from veterans, often in whispers over coffee or cigarettes. Wire the valve open and don't tell the brass. Lockheed eventually gave in to reality. By mid-1944, the P-38J rolled off the line with redesigned intercoolers that mimicked the field modification. The airflow path was cleaner, simpler, and no longer throttled by a thermostat. The Lightning could finally climb to 30,000 feet without gasping for breath. It had taken one illegal act to unlock its destiny. But success comes with eyes. Kondo's intelligence summary reached Japan in the winter of 1944. There, engineers at Nakajima and Mitsubishi studied his diagrams with fascination. They realized that their own high-altitude fighters suffered similar issues. Superchargers that overheated, valves that restricted airflow in thin air. The American absurd trick wasn't absurd at all. It was genius in its simplicity. They tried to imitate it. A prototype Ki-84 with modified intercooler controls was tested in secret, but by then fuel shortages and bombings crippled production. The lesson came too late. The irony was painful. The spy who had exposed America's secret could not convince his own superiors to act on it. The rigid chain of command he served would not permit such freedom. Meanwhile, in the skies over Europe, the Lightning was reborn. Its pilots flew escort missions deep into Germany, their once flawed engines now steady as iron. Luftwaffe fighters that had dominated high altitude found themselves chased instead of chasing. The same twin tails that once signaled vulnerability now marked danger. American pilots didn't know about the spy. They didn't know that somewhere in Tokyo men were reading their reports, analyzing the lines of their machines, trying to understand their courage. They only knew that their plane finally worked as it should. Still, bureaucracy leaves its scars. Years later, when Lockheed historians compiled the official story of the P-38's evolution, they credited design reviews, test data, and factory modifications. The anonymous sergeant's name was never mentioned. His act of rebellion disappeared beneath neat paragraphs about field adjustments. Kondo's report survived the war. It was found in 1946 among captured Japanese documents. In careful handwriting, one note in the margin stands out. Their mechanic understood what their engineers did not. This is why they are dangerous. What is danger, after all, if not the power to learn faster than your enemy? The anonymous mechanic never knew that a foreign spy had once studied his handiwork. He never knew that his absurd trick had been discussed in Tokyo war rooms. But his legacy lived on in the engines of the P-38J, in every pilot who survived because his Lightning could finally climb through the thin, cruel air of Europe. There is a peculiar justice in that. In a war ruled by strategy, orders, and hierarchy, victory came from the unranked, the uncelebrated, the ones who trusted their instincts over protocol. And somewhere, perhaps in the wreckage of a hangar long reclaimed by sand, lies the memory of a single wrench turn that reshaped the sky. If stories like this make you wonder what other forgotten hands shaped the outcome of the war, stay with us. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and ask yourself, in your own world, what rule would you break to make things right? The war wasn't over yet. For the P-38, new enemies waited: ice, altitude, and politics. And soon, even greater secrets would emerge from the factories of Burbank, where Lockheed engineers raced to turn defiance into doctrine. By early 1944, Lockheed's engineers could no longer pretend the Desert Miracle was a fluke. Reports from the 1st, 82nd, and 14th Fighter Groups, three of the most battle-tested P-38 units, painted an undeniable picture. Aircraft with field bypass thermostatic valves were outperforming stock models at high altitude. Climb rates were higher. Engine detonation was reduced. Missions flown above 25,000 feet were returning with fewer casualties. The numbers were hard to ignore. Yet at Burbank, pride was a powerful thing. Lockheed's technical department had spent years perfecting the Lightning's intercooler system. They had modeled airflow, thermal gradients, and pressure ratios with scientific precision. The thermostatic valve, they insisted, was essential. Without it, cold shock could crack manifolds and overcool the turbochargers. But war was proving their math wrong. At Wright Field, Air Technical Service Command began conducting its own experiments. Modified P-38Fs and GS, configured like the Desert Lightnings, were flown side by side with factory-standard models. The results were irrefutable. The unauthorized versions climbed faster, sustained higher power, and reached greater ceiling altitudes. Engine wear was minimal. Colonel Landon's final report put it bluntly: current thermostatic regulation impairs combat performance. Recommend redesign following field precedent. That was bureaucratic language for a simple truth. Lockheed had been beaten by its own mechanic. Inside the company, arguments erupted. Senior engineer Kelly Johnson, the brilliant but headstrong designer who had overseen the P-38's development, read the test results with quiet fury. He was proud, and with reason. The Lightning was his masterpiece, the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour, the first with counter-rotating props and turbo-superchargers. To admit that a field hand had discovered a better configuration was painful. But Johnson was also pragmatic. He gathered his team in a hangar late one evening. On the wall behind him hung the latest drawings for the new production model, the P-38J. "We can ignore them," he said, "or we can learn from them." The room was silent. Then one young engineer, barely 23, spoke up. "Sir, they're right. The system's too conservative. We designed for reliability, not combat." Johnson didn't answer immediately. He studied the blueprint, the web of lines and calculations that represented thousands of hours of work, and finally nodded. "Then we fix it. But we fix it properly." That was how defiance in the desert became doctrine in California. Lockheed's new P-38J introduced a re-engineered intercooler and turbo-supercharger arrangement. The old system, which ran through the wing leading edges and relied on thermostatic regulation, was replaced with direct-flow intercoolers built into the engine nacelles. Air now entered cleanly, without restriction, cooling efficiency improved, and boost pressure stayed strong even at 30,000 feet. It was, in every technical sense, the institutionalization of the mechanics bypass. When the first P-38J arrived in North Africa in mid-1944, pilots noticed the difference instantly. The aircraft climbed like it had never climbed before. Engine response was immediate, smooth, eager. Gone was the hesitant lag above the thin layers. They could now fight Bf-109GS and FW-190 as on even terms, sometimes better. By then, the P-38 had already become central to America's strategy. It served as a long-range escort, a reconnaissance platform, a fighter bomber. In Europe, it flew over the Alps and deep into the Reich. In the Pacific, it became the long arm of island warfare. And everywhere it went, the legacy of that anonymous bypass followed. In April 1943, even before Lockheed's redesign, the P-38 had proven its reach in one of the most dramatic missions of the war, the interception of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's aircraft over Bougainville. Two Lightnings, guided by intelligence intercepts, had flown nearly 1,000 miles round-trip to ambush the architect of Pearl Harbor. The success of that mission showed what the Lightning could do when flown to its limits. But those pilots, too, had struggled with altitude performance. They knew what the plane could be, if only it could breathe. Now, in 1944, it finally could. The new models were rushed to both theaters. The 55th Fighter Group in England received P-38JS just as they began escorting heavy bombers on daylight raids into Germany. For the first time, they could climb with the Mustangs and Thunderbolts, yet fly farther and strike harder. Pilots described the new Lightning as a different beast. One of them, Lieutenant Robert Bear Hoffman, wrote to his family, "She finally does what they told us she could. I don't have to pray through the climb anymore." But while the front line celebrated, behind closed doors, Lockheed's executives were careful to control the narrative. They could not publicly admit that an enlisted man's modification had inspired the redesign. Instead, press releases credited ongoing performance evaluations and advances in thermal control efficiency. In war, image mattered almost as much as victory. Still, among pilots and mechanics, the truth was legend. At field reunions decades later, veterans would still talk about the guy in Tunisia. They never knew his name, but they knew what he'd done. Some claimed he was from Texas, others from Michigan. Some said he'd been reprimanded, others that he'd been quietly commended. The records remain silent. Perhaps that is fitting. In a war filled with names, his story became every mechanic's story, the voice of those who fixed what others had broken. Meanwhile, back in Japan, Lieutenant Kondo watched with growing unease as reports from the European and Pacific fronts poured in. His warnings had been right. The Americans had turned field improvisation into corporate policy. Lockheed's production lines were now rolling out Lightnings faster, lighter, and stronger than ever. Axis pilots were noticing. Captured German documents in 1944 reveal a new tone. The Lightning, previously vulnerable above 6 kilometers, now exhibits sustained performance equal to or superior to the Bf-109G6. The Luftwaffe command ordered new tactics to counter the improved P-38. Avoid vertical climbs, exploit turning ability, attack from above only if the element of surprise could be maintained. In other words, they had lost the advantage. Kondo translated these findings for Tokyo. His final report was grim. The Americans adapt faster than doctrine can predict. Their industrial system allows feedback from the front to redesign production in months. This is not a technical advantage, it is a cultural one. He was right. In America, engineers and mechanics were not enemies, they were partners separated by distance but united by necessity. Field ingenuity flowed back to the factory, and the factory responded. That loop of adaptation would become the hallmark of Allied success. From radar improvements to tank engines, the pattern repeated. The field discovered, the factory refined, the front benefited. The P-38 became the emblem of that process. By late 1944, as the Allies advanced through Italy and France, Lightning swept across Europe with confidence. Their turbochargers howled through the thin air above the clouds, silver arcs slicing toward contrails of enemy bombers. In the Pacific, they hunted Japanese fighters over New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually the skies near Tokyo itself. Japanese pilots, once contemptuous of the heavy twin-engine design, now feared it. They called it the two-tailed dragon. Its range, its stability, and now its altitude power made it a nightmare opponent. The irony was cruel. Some of the men who feared it most had once studied the very modification that made it deadly. Kondo's absurd trick report became a footnote in his own country's archives, unread by the officers who dismissed it as enemy propaganda. When Allied forces occupied Japan in 1945, American intelligence officers found the file tucked among stacks of technical assessments. It was translated, archived, and quietly forgotten. But inside Lockheed, the lesson was never forgotten. After the war, Kelly Johnson would lead the creation of the Skunk Works, the secret division that built the next generation of aircraft, the U-2, the State Route 71, the stealth projects that defined the Cold War. His mantra to his engineers was simple: the man closest to the problem knows the solution. That philosophy had been born in the desert with one nameless mechanic. It's strange, isn't it, how a single act of disobedience can echo for decades? How the hands of one man can alter the course of both technology and history. The Lightning story is not only about innovation, it's about humility. It shows that no design, no authority is perfect. Perfection must be tested in the dust, in the heat, in the chaos where theory breaks. By war's end, over 10,000 P-38s had been built. They destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other U.S. fighter. They escorted bombers from North Africa to Berlin and from the Solomons to Tokyo. And inside each of them, somewhere between the turbines and the wires, lived the ghost of a bypassed valve. If you listen closely to those old Allison engines, restored now in museums, roaring to life for airshows, you can almost hear it. The sound of defiance made mechanical. It is a reminder that progress, in war and in peace, often begins not with permission, but with conviction. So what do you think? Was it luck, genius, or sheer desperation that made that mechanic act? Tell us below. And stay with us, because the next chapter of this story reveals how that spirit of improvisation would transform not just one airplane, but the entire post-war world of aviation. By the last winter of the war, 1944 into 1945, the P-38 Lightning had become a paradox. To the generals in Washington, it was a success story of American engineering. To the pilots who flew it, it was proof that victory depended not on design, but on the courage to question design. And to the men who built it, those who turned wrenches under desert suns or Arctic wind, it was something else entirely. It was a living creature, temperamental, stubborn, and now, finally, understood. Lockheed's new models, the J and L variants, were everywhere. They carried long-range drop tanks, better armor, and the new direct-flow intercooler system that ended the altitude curse once and for all. Pilots could now climb to 30,000 feet and beyond without losing power, without praying their engines wouldn't choke. The Lightning had been reborn. In the skies above Europe, the transformation was undeniable. Where once German pilots had looked down upon the twin tails of the P-38, now they found them beside them, or above. Combat logs from early 1945 record a shift in tone. Luftwaffe pilots who once mocked the American fork-tailed devil began to respect it, even fear it. The P-38 now climbs as if pushed by the hand of God, one German officer wrote bitterly after a failed interception. But back in California, the real storm was only beginning. Victory had brought pride but also questions. How had the United States, with all its resources, allowed such a critical design flaw to exist for so long? How could one field mechanic have seen what an entire company of engineers had missed? Within Lockheed, the question became a quiet reckoning. Kelly Johnson and his design team, now hailed as heroes, knew the truth. The company's post-war reports acknowledged, in carefully chosen language, that field observations led to refinements in intercooler performance. It was a sanitized confession, but a confession nonetheless. The Army Air Forces, soon to become the independent U.S. Air Force, took note. They began rewriting their entire approach to feedback and testing. No longer would field mechanics be ignored. No longer would ideas be dismissed simply because they came from below. The P-38's transformation had proven something no bureaucrat could deny. Innovation doesn't always come from the top. In the months that followed, new programs were launched, faster, more flexible development cycles, direct communication between frontline units and engineering divisions, and post-mission analysis teams that included not just pilots, but the men who maintained their planes. It was the birth of a new culture, responsive, iterative, and alive. Yet while America evolved, its enemies collapsed under the weight of rigidity. In Tokyo, Lieutenant Hiroshi Kondo's warnings were buried under paperwork. By the time his absurd trick report reached the upper command, the war was already lost. Fuel shortages grounded the few remaining Japanese fighters. Factories lay in ruins. Engineers who had once designed elegant machines now scavenged scrap metal to keep prototypes running. Kondo watched from the shadows of defeat, realizing that the very flexibility he had admired and envied in the Americans had been his own nation's missing weapon. He would later tell an American interviewer after the war, "We studied your aircraft. We knew the P-38's weakness. And then one day it was gone. We never understood how you changed so quickly. Now I know, it was because someone below was allowed to think." That idea haunted him. For Japan, innovation had been a top-down affair. Perfection was the goal, not adaptation. But war favors the imperfect that learns faster. Meanwhile in Europe, the Lightning closed out its campaign with a vengeance. It escorted bombers over Munich, attacked trains in Austria, and strafed convoys across the Alps. In those final months, with Germany collapsing and the skies thick with contrails, P-38s roamed freely at altitudes once forbidden. Pilots marveled at how the engines now responded, how the climb held all the way through the thin air. Some swore they could feel the spirit of that anonymous mechanic in the hum of the turbines. Others simply thanked him in silence. There is a story, perhaps true, perhaps just legend, of a Lockheed engineer visiting an airfield in Italy after the redesign had taken effect. He met a group of mechanics who had been working on the earlier models, the same men who had wired open the valves. They showed him their modifications, still proud, still defiant. "You know," the engineer said with a faint smile, "we fixed that at the factory." One of the mechanics, wiping oil from his hands, looked up and replied, "No, sir. We fixed it here." It was a small moment, but it captured the entire spirit of the war. By 1945, the Lightning had become a symbol not just of technological might, but of human adaptability. It embodied what the war itself demanded: flexibility in chaos. It was the first American aircraft to truly master long-range escort before the Mustang arrived, and it had pioneered twin-engine fighter tactics that would define future jets. And yet, behind its evolution was the story of humility, the recognition that even the brightest minds can be wrong, and that truth can come from the dirt as easily as from a drawing board. In the aftermath of the war, when the jets came and the propeller age ended, Lockheed carried that lesson into every new project. The skunk works that Johnson built was born from the same spirit of defiance that had once terrified his engineers. If it works in the field, he told his team, it's real. Paper is only the beginning. Under that philosophy came the U-2 spy plane, the State Route 71 Blackbird, and the stealth designs that defied radar itself. Each carried a fragment of the P-38's legacy, a belief that innovation begins with courage, not approval. But for the men who had lived it, the memory remained personal. Veterans spoke of the Lightning not as a machine but as a comrade that had finally found its strength. They told stories of the early days, of the thin air over Tunisia and the wrench that rewrote destiny. Some kept fragments of engine parts or bent pieces of intercooler pipe as keepsakes, reminders of a time when rules bent and miracles followed. At reunions decades later, one old pilot was asked what he remembered most about his P-38. He didn't speak of speed or firepower. He said, "She used to choke up there. Then one day she didn't. None of us knew why, but we knew who." Oh, indeed. No one ever identified the mechanic. The Army Air Forces had no record of who performed the first bypass. Some believe it was a sergeant in the 82nd Fighter Group. Others claim it happened in the 1st. There were rumors, always rumors, but no name ever surfaced. In a sense, that anonymity became his legacy. He became every forgotten hand that ever tightened a bolt and changed the course of a war. When peace came, the Lightnings were slowly retired. Some were sold as surplus, others scrapped. Their once mighty frames melted down to feed the peacetime economy they had helped secure. Yet a few survived, restored, polished, displayed in museums. Visitors stand beneath them now, reading plaques that speak of speed and range, of twin booms and long missions. Few mention the bypass. And that's how history works. The smallest revolutions often vanish beneath the neat language of official reports. But if you stand close enough to one of those old P-38s, close enough to smell the faint trace of oil and metal, you can almost sense it, the quiet defiance built into its heart. Across the Pacific, in post-war Tokyo, Hiroshi Kondo walked through the ruins of his former office. The war had ended. His superiors were gone, his files seized. But among the papers scattered on the floor, he found a single folder stamped "Confidential." Inside was his own report, the one that had once called an American mechanic's trick absurd. He smiled sadly and placed it back on the shelf. "Absurd," he whispered, "is what wins wars." Years later, when Japan rebuilt and began producing some of the most advanced aircraft in the world, the new engineers studied not just German designs, but American methods. The open channels between factory and field, the culture that allowed innovation from below. In a way, the lesson of that anonymous American sergeant helped shape both sides of the future. The P-38's journey, from flawed experiment to high-altitude predator, was more than a story of metal and machines. It was a story of faith in human instinct, of the rare moment when defiance becomes duty. It was proof that war, brutal as it is, sometimes forces us to become better than our blueprints. And as the world moved on, as jets replaced propellers and the noise of progress drowned out the old songs of pistons and propellers, one truth remained: the strength of any machine lies not in its design, but in the hands that dare to change it. The Lightning had learned to breathe. Humanity perhaps had too. If these stories of forgotten ingenuity move you, subscribe and stay with us. Because the final chapter of the Lightning's legacy is not about war. It's about what came after, when peace arrived, and the same spirit that saved lives in battle began shaping the skies of the modern world. The war ended, but the sound of the Lightning's engines did not fade from memory. Across airfields now quiet and empty, their echoes still lingered, the deep, rhythmic hum of twin Allisons that had once carried men into a sky filled with fire and uncertainty. For those who had flown them or worked on them, that sound was more than noise. It was a heartbeat, steady, human, defiant. In 1945, as peace settled over a shattered world, thousands of P-38s stood lined up on European and Pacific runways, their wings streaked with dust, their propellers tied down for the last time. Mechanics who had once labored through sleepless nights now had nothing left to fix. Pilots who had once climbed into the thin air of battle now walked the tarmac with their hands in their pockets, listening to the silence they had bought with their courage. Among the hundreds of decommissioned aircraft, there were whispers, stories traded like sacred memory. Someone would lean close and say, "Did you ever hear about the guy in Tunisia? The one who made it climb?" And the others would nod. Some said he'd been promoted quietly before the war ended. Others said he'd been forgotten as soon as the factory fixed the problem. But everyone agreed on one thing: without him, the Lightning would never have lived up to its name. When the United States Army Air Forces became the independent U.S. Air Force in 1947, the story of that field modification had already turned into a parable told in training rooms. It was no longer about one aircraft. It was about the philosophy that would guide a new era of aviation: that innovation does not always wait for permission, that the best engineers listen to those who work closest to the machine. Kelly Johnson carried that belief forward. In the years after the war, he founded Lockheed's Skunk Works, a place where bureaucracy was stripped away and ideas could live or die on their results alone. There were no titles on the doors, no rigid hierarchies, just minds and machines. The spirit of the desert mechanic lived in every rule Johnson broke. From that small division came the aircraft that defined the Cold War, the U-2 that flew above the clouds unseen, the State Route 71 that outran the wind, and the stealth craft that turned radar into an illusion. They were miracles of engineering, but their DNA carried the same truth: speed and altitude are nothing without imagination. The Lightning's lesson had become an American creed. But the story did not belong only to America. In post-war Japan, the ruins of once proud factories slowly filled again with the hum of machinery. Men who had read Kondo's intelligence reports now built civilian airliners, commercial engines, and industrial marvels. The empire was gone, but the hunger to create remained. And quietly, many of those engineers took a lesson from their former enemies: the willingness to adapt, to question, to change. Years later, one Japanese historian would write, "Our defeat was not only military. It was philosophical. The Americans allowed chaos to think. We silenced it." In that sense, the anonymous American mechanic had done something no weapon could achieve. He had changed the way his enemies thought. Time has a way of sanding down the edges of memory. The Lightning, once feared, became a relic. By the 1960s, it was almost forgotten, overshadowed by jet engines and nuclear bombers. Yet, among aviators and historians, it remained a symbol, a reminder that behind every machine are hands, and behind every system, a soul. In 1971, Martin Kaidin published Fork-tailed Devil, the P-38, chronicling the aircraft's full story. Buried within its pages was a brief mention of field modifications in North Africa that dramatically improved high-altitude performance. It didn't name names. It didn't dwell on details. But between those lines, every pilot who had lived through that time could see the ghost of the man who had started it all. That same year, a group of veterans restored a surviving P-38 to flight in California. When the engines first roared to life after decades of silence, a crowd of gray-haired men stood watching. Some saluted. Some wept. One of them leaned to another and said, "Listen, she breathes right this time." The mechanic would have smiled at that. By then, Lockheed was deep into the jet age, but every new aircraft it produced owed something to the humility learned from the Lightning. The company that had once dismissed field ingenuity now depended on it. The military that had once punished disobedience now encouraged creativity. What began as a single act of rebellion had reshaped an entire system. The story, at its heart, is not just about the P-38. It is about the strange, beautiful relationship between man and machine, how every creation reflects the imperfection of its maker, and how, sometimes, it takes an imperfect hand to make it whole. It's about courage, not the kind that charges into battle, but the quieter kind that bends a rule, risks a reprimand, and believes that one small change can save a life. And it's about memory, how easily the true authors of progress are forgotten, how history prefers generals to sergeants, and victory speeches to grease-stained wrenches. In the end, the Lightning's greatest triumph was not its speed, nor its range, nor the enemies it destroyed. It was what it taught about the fragile miracle of innovation, that progress often begins in defiance, that truth can rise from the ground up, and that somewhere between the factory and the field lies the real heart of invention. In 1992, at an air show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, a restored P-38L performed a slow, deliberate climb over the crowd. Its twin tails glinted in the sunlight, the engine steady and smooth. As it passed overhead, the announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. "This is the aircraft that outclimbed every Axis fighter by the end of the war, thanks to a mechanic whose name we may never know." The crowd applauded. The engines thundered past, and for a brief moment, it was 1943 again. The desert, the heat, the fear, all of it alive in the roar of two engines that once struggled for breath and now own the sky. It is tempting to see that story as myth, to imagine that perhaps it's been polished over time, that no single man could have made such a difference. But the records, sparse as they are, confirm the physics. The bypass worked. The climb rate improved. The redesign followed. And the timeline fits. Sometimes truth needs no embellishment. Perhaps that's why the story endures. Because in the end, it is not about nationality or technology. It is about the shared human instinct to look at something broken and say, it can be better. It's about that spark of rebellion that exists in every mind that refuses to accept failure as final. The Lightning's transformation is proof that history is not made only in grand decisions or official orders. Sometimes, it happens in the quiet hum of an airfield, under the hand of someone who is simply tired of watching good men die. So when we remember the war, the machines, the factories, the victories, let us also remember the moments of quiet defiance that gave those machines their soul. The wrench turn. The wire cut. The decision that changed everything. The Mechanics' Act didn't just save airplanes. It saved lives. And in doing so, it reminded the world that even in war, progress is a matter of faith. Faith that one person's idea, however small, can reach beyond rank, beyond orders, beyond time itself. If this story has carried you back through the engines, through the dust, through the courage of those forgotten hands, then let it remind you of this simple truth. Every great leap in history begins with someone who refuses to stand still. The Lightning climbs still, not through clouds but through memory. And somewhere in that endless blue above us, the sound of twin engines still whispers the same eternal question. What would you change if the world told you not to? Subscribe and keep listening, because history is full of stories like this one, waiting to rise again.